Hello. So yeah, I'm Tina Moore, and as I was introduced, I'm the Senior User Experience Designer for Magento Business Intelligence, which means I spend my time optimizing tools that help you create data visualizations. So why are we talking about telling stories with them today? Well, in the world we're in right now, we have this growing amount of data that we're able to capture and use, but we need ways to put that into a human interpretable visuals, right? So it's not always easy to tell stories with data, but that's sort of where this data visualization comes in. It's very large, or it's very hard for humans to interpret large quantities of data. We can only hold about 5 values in our minds for comparison before we need some sort of a visual analogy to help us along. So that's where data visualization comes in. And what we're going to try to do today is talk about how we can actually tell better stories with the tools that we have to create these. So, great data visualization tells a story. Right here is an example. This might look more modern than you think it is. This is from the 1800s. It was created by a French civil engineer named Joseph Menard, and it depicts Napoleon's troop movements during the 1812 Russia campaign. So the story that this is telling is one of immense loss. He's showing a lot of data here, which I'll walk you through in a second. But overall, it kind of condenses into a single story. So we have the number of troops that went out on this expedition, which is both these wide bars, the tan and the black one. We have the direction that they're moving, so tan on the way out and black on the way back. And you can see as they go out, it slowly dwindles, and on the way back, it even more so. He also packs a lot more into this, so he's packing in, their location, their latitude and longitude, weather at certain dates, river crossings, and a few more things even. But the story is that when they left, they had about 400,000 plus troops as they went out, and when they reached Moscow, they only had 100,000 troops left. And then on the way back, they lost all but 10,000 troops. So in this one infographic, he both shows the story of the loss of life as well as some of the contributing factors to why that happened. So let's talk about some best practices for data visualization. Edward Tufte, he's kind of a pioneer of the theories around data visualization, and he's always seeking excellence in data visualization through clarity, precision, and efficiency. And these are some of the tenets that he follows. So we always want to show the data. We never want to hide it. We want to put it out there for the user to be able to take in and understand themselves. We want them to think about the substance rather than perhaps the methodology that we use to find it or the way it's being displayed. We want to avoid distorting data. So it's very easy to do, and you can do it to make your case better, but in reality, that's sort of manipulating the user, and we want to avoid doing that. We want to encourage comparison. So by showing values against one another, we allow them to make the connections themselves. We want to show data at different levels. So this can either be drilling into something or showing multiple supporting graphs that might build your case. And then everything that you show should serve a clear purpose. And if it doesn't, you should consider removing it, because maybe it's just creating extra mental burden for your audience. So we're going to look at some examples, some good ones, bad, and some bad, ugly uses of data as well. So this might look familiar to some of you. It is a map of the London Underground. And on the left-hand side, we have an older version, and on the right-hand side, we have a version redesigned by Henry Charles Beck in 1930. And what his innovation did was, in the previous older ones, they were always overlaid on roadway maps. So they were geographically correct, and they showed the appropriate distances between things. But what Beck realized was his audience, who was the underground riders, didn't really care about where they were in relation geographically on the map. What they really cared about was how many stops they had before they had to get off, what line they were on, where the connection points were, and so he was able to take all that in and sort of redesign this in a way that made it more linear, improved hierarchy, so you can read things better with color and sizes of these different stations, and he sort of spaced everything out evenly so that it was very easy to tell what stations were what, rather than things being more clumped together in the more dense parts of the city. So this was sort of an innovation of the time, And it has since become kind of a blueprint that most cities follow when they're redesigning their underground maps. Let's talk about a little more modern example. So this is Google Research's music exploration tool. And this is really showing the power of interactivity. It allows the user to sort of dig into these different areas where they can see genres, subgenres, and artists, and how their popularity sort of impacted the overall scope of music over time. It's really fun, and it gives a lot of power into being able to dig down and back out very easily. So, these are some of the more modern things that can be done with data visualization. So let's look at some bad practices, some things to be avoided. 3 dimensions on 2 dimensions is always a bad idea. Do not show your graphs in 3D. They're very hard for the human eye to interpret. It's hard to tell where these things line up, and it's also hard to tell relative size against one another in 3 dimensions. So like looking at this pie graph at the bottom, which pie graphs have some other issues as well that we'll get to later, but if you put it in 3D and you're trying to compare these things, item A and item C look like they could be about the same size, when in reality, if you look at a top view, item A is twice the size. So it's very misleading. And then on the right-hand side, or the right-hand side here, we have just too many data points. Things are getting overloaded. It's very hard to tell what's going on here. And if you come to this point, you might want to ask yourself, how do I break this apart? How do I make this more interpretable for the user? Then we have some misleading data, and this is the ugly way to use data. So this is kind of the lying or misleading. On the left-hand side here, we can see this interest rate graph, and it's almost doubling over time, right? It's pretty scary. But when put in the context of the 0 axis, it's pretty much flat. So this is just inducing the user to think that, there's something wrong here when in fact there really isn't. And this one's often used in media. We'll see this a lot. So keep an eye out for it. The other one is causing false correlations. So what am I supposed to take from this graph on the right? Am I supposed to think, Internet Explorer was so terrible that it incited murder, and thank goodness that it's going away, I guess, right? But that's just a false correlation. These things have nothing to do with one another. So, make sure that when you're creating graphs that these correlations actually make sense. So, how do you tell your story with data? First of all, when you're doing analysis, you're going to be digging deeply, right? You're going to be mining for these gold nuggets, these insights that you're looking for. You're doing a lot of work to do that. You don't necessarily want to show all of that work. You want to show these insights. This is the story that you want to tell. So by showing all the work that you've put into finding these, even though it can be tempting, what you're doing is you're actually distracting from your overall point, and you're adding too much confusion for the audience to be able to parse through and actually understand what your story is. So be careful when you're crafting these to really think about what those true insights are. How do you tell a good story? So this is the good news, is people love stories. So if you can put your data into a story, you're going to get a lot more out of it. So the way you can start doing that, at least, is to storyboard. And this can just be something simple as deciding what's the beginning, middle, and end of your narrative, and then thinking about the flow of that narrative. Do you want it to be chronological and sort of build out the steps that you took to understand where this insight came from? Or you could start with the insight and then bring in establishing data to back up your finding. Then finally, we want to talk about the power of repetition. So you want people to be able to walk away and repeat what the nugget that you're trying to get them to understand, right? So think about soundbites even. Is there some way that you can sort of have this soundbite of something that is repeatable, that people can go walk away and remember and repeat for you? And then finally, when we're crafting this, we need to answer who, why, how, and what. So who is going to be your audience? You want to think about who you're telling your story to and be specific about this. If you go too broad, it's hard to sort of meet all the needs and different levels of understanding that people have when you're trying to craft a story. So if you're having trouble narrowing your audience, think about who the decision maker in the room might be, and think about crafting the narrative for them specifically. And then what's your relationship to the audience? Do they trust you as like their data expert, and they know that what you're going to present them is valid, or do you need to build some confidence with what they're saying? And this is just something you sort of keep in mind as we're going through some of these other questions, and it might help guide you as to the right answer. So what's your goals? This is something that you should set for your audience at the end. You want them to come away knowing something or taking some sort of action. It's easy to sort of think that I'm just going to present all of this information and they're the smarter ones, so they're going to figure out what to do with it. But in reality, you're the one who's been digging into it. You're the subject matter expert on this thing. So you should always have recommendations or suggestions or at least an opinion about what the next steps or actions that they should take are. So this is going to be how you present it. And there's really, kind of two ends of the spectrum here. You can do sort of a presentation or a report. And on the presentation side, you have all the control. You can walk them through the narrative. You can really control how they're consuming the story that you're telling them. And on the other side, you have reports that have a ton of detail, but you can't necessarily control the assumptions that they're taking away from that. So this is sort of something you have to weigh when you're making decisions. You also want to consider your tone. Are you trying to get them to make a decision, or are you celebrating something? Do you need to light a fire with this? Make sure that's coming across in the story that you're telling. And again, keep your audience in mind as you're making these choices. So what data do we actually show? You have to pick your supporting evidence from sort of all of the things that you found that really support this one insight that we're trying to talk about. And remember, when you're doing this, don't show everything. So make sure it's only things that build to that point. And then finally, you have to pick the right visualization for the job. So how do we actually go about picking these visualizations? Earlier, we saw a bunch of examples of some pretty elaborate visualizations, which may not necessarily be the most useful for you in your day-to-day. And there's tons of them out there, but let's just go over some of the most common ones and how and when you might use them. So we have line charts and area charts. These are great for analyzing trends, comparing different values, understanding distributions, analyzing a relationship of different things, and with an area chart, it's great for visualizing the composition or the makeup of something. These are the best when they're done over a periodic data, so over a time period. When you're doing a line chart, you should always use solid lines, and be careful about how many you're plotting, because it can just get overly busy and you're just going to the user won't end up being able to take anything away from the graph. And then an area chart, you should always have the most highly variable data plotted at the top, so it's the easiest to spot. For column charts, these again can be used over time, but they don't have to be. They can also be used for categorical data, so you're going to be able to analyze trends with these, compare different values, understand distribution, and with the stacked ones, also visualize composition. These are the ones you really need to make sure you have your zero access for, so that you're not distorting data like we saw before. With a column chart, you could have multiple columns next to each other, but you want to make sure you're not doing too many so that, again, it doesn't get too visually busy. And with the stacked one, you want to make sure that these are part of a whole, that these things belong together. Bar charts are pretty similar, but they're not necessarily for over time. They're more for that categorical comparison. So you can compare values, the distribution of data, and visualize some compositions with these. Again, you want to make sure you have the zero access. They're great for long category names because we like to read left to right. So when you're reading this, your eye goes directly into the bar that's associated with it. And again, they can be used to represent a part of a whole. The stacked ones can. So here we get to pie charts, and I mentioned earlier that there's some issues with pie charts. So pie charts are really hard for people to read. Our brains are not very good at picking out the different size chunks. We don't read those angle differences very well. So you have to be very careful when using these. When you use one, you need to make sure that it is really, truly a part of a meaningful whole and that these things belong together. You generally only want to have about 5 different variables represented here. Otherwise, it just becomes unintelligible. And it's also good to have some differences between the values so that they're not all just showing the same exact size or very close similar sizes. But if you do decide to use these, they're good for showing compositions and comparing values. So they do have their uses. And then we have a numerical value, which may seem very simple, but sometimes these are great just for highlighting a really important piece of data. You don't want to use too many of these because then they start to diminish that impact. And you always want to pair it with some sort of text that's giving it context so people know what they're looking at here. We have tables and heat maps. So these are good for comparing values, but they work in a little bit different way. Tables are interacting with our verbal system. So rather than being a visual element, we read these. And you really don't want to use these during a presentation. They're not great. People won't be able to take a lot away from them. Unlike heat maps could be used because they're a little more visual and they're great for picking out like the highs and lows of things. Let's see, I think this is our last one here, but we have some scatter plots and bubble charts. They're great for comparing values and analyzing relationships, seeing how different things impact one another as they change. You always want to have zero excesses again with these to avoid any sort of distortion of the data. So let's say we picked our visualization, and now we want to make the most out of the one that we picked, right? How do we do that? So here we have a visualization that may not be the best. So there may be some ways we can improve this one. And some of those ways are we can make the data the focus. So this is the first thing we want people to see is the data that's going on up here. We don't want them to get stuck with all these other things. These other things, this clutter, it's creating cognitive load. So basically, when a person comes in, they need to parse all this information, and then they'll understand the data. But what we want them to do is understand the data as quickly as possible without having to go through looking at all this other stuff that's going on in the graph. So keep it clean, don't be afraid of white space, but it's always important to label explicitly. So even though we're trying to keep it clean, we want to make sure there's nothing being lost in the context that we're delivering here. And finally, considering hierarchy and working with expectations. So our brains like to read left to right, top to bottom. We kind of do a zigzag as we do it. So use that to your advantage when you're considering how to put titles and things like that on the chart. So let's see how we can improve this one. First step, we can remove that background and border. Right away, that's cleaning up the graph quite a bit. Next, we can remove these vertical grid lines because we don't really need them. Our eyes can do it for us pretty much. We can also remove these data markers because, again, they're not helping us out that much, and by removing them, it makes the lines and their interaction a lot more obvious. We can clean up our axis labels. We don't need these decimals. We don't need full names here. We can abbreviate without losing any context. Then we can remove sort of the tick marks on the left and the bottom because, again, it's just adding visual noise. We want to be explicit. So let's make that top title, instead of abbreviating it, let's make it the full thing. Let's add names on both the axes and even add dollar signs on the left so people are really clear what they're looking at here. They're looking at dollars over time. And finally, we can consider hierarchy, and we can make some changes there. We can move the title over and make it bolder so people see that first. Then they come across and they read our legend. So before they even see the data, they're seeing the legend and they know what they're looking at. So overall, we just need to strike a balance here, right, between showing context and making things clean. There's a lot you can remove from graphs usually. So how can we tell an e-commerce story? So let's try to do one really fast here. So I've done a bunch of exploratory analysis, right, and I found this really awesome insight. I think there's a group of people that we could target with a marketing campaign if we act right now. So I'm going to prepare my story. Who am I targeting? I can target some marketers at my company, and I'm their data person, so they trust me. Why am I doing this? I see an opportunity to provide a proactive strategy of customers that we can target that are going to convert at a higher rate than normal. And I'm going to leave them with a list of people to go out and do marketing to afterwards. How am I going to do this? I'm just going to give a really quick presentation because I think I can do it fast, and then they can take action on it as quickly as possible. And what do I have? I have a few graphs that I've pulled together, and I'm going to use them to support my argument. So here's the beginning of my story. There's a group of customers that have targeted with marketing during a specific window. They're going to convert at a rate of 38% or higher, and our typical rate is about 20%, so that's a good bump for us. By looking at the volume of customers, so by looking at this chart here, I can see how many customers have placed one order this year. It's about 2,600 customers. And then looking at the likelihood that they're going to convert again and make a second purchase, I can see that we have about 1,000 more orders that could be placed this year by those customers. Next, I took a look at the average time between orders. So the order between first order and second order is about 4 to 8 months. From this, I was able to make a list of emails for these clients who have placed an order in the last 4 to 8 months, who are most likely to convert and make a second purchase. So, what tools and resources do you have at your disposal to be able to do this? Well, I mean, there's some pretty common ones, like Excel, PowerPoint, some business intelligence tools, but it's really more important is how you're telling this story and using some of the tools we talked about earlier today. Really quick, I just want to talk to you a little bit about MBI. Magento Business Intelligence, we have a lot of out-of-the-box dashboards that exist, and they tell a lot of stories for you that are baked in there already. For instance, that story I just told exists on one of our out-of-the-box dashboards. If you have this, you can go and use it tomorrow and target those customers. We also support building your own custom reports and doing exploration so that you can really support making your own stories. Finally, here's a few resources in case you're interested in learning a little bit more about data visualization and storytelling. We have a blog for some e-commerce data strategy, and then if you want to learn more about Magento BI, we have some links down there. Finally, I just want to end this with, if you ever want to get involved with anything to do with data or Magento BI, we always have projects going on, and we're always looking for feedback and talking to clients. So if you're interested, find me afterwards, and we can exchange information. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions that there are. Any questions? All right. Well, thank you very much.